a colleague, as a great administrator, and as a wonderful program idea man. Comes up with ideas and knows how to implement them. His name is Richard Lawrence. He's the Chief Operating Officer at FEED. In this role, he supports FEED's business unit leaders, supervises program measurement, and participates in organizational strategy and business planning. He's also the publisher of FEED's flagship quarterly magazine, The Freeman. Richard serves on the board of directors of the Coalition to Reduce Spending, an advocacy group established to place meaningful controls on federal spending. He serves on the board of directors of Oberg Research. He's a graduate of the Charles Koch Institute's Liberty at Work program, the Atlas Network's Leadership Academy. His professional background includes service at the Illinois Policy Institute and Truth in Accounting, where he co-founded the interactive fiscal database known as statedatalab.org. He's traveled to over 30 countries and has been published in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Chicago Sun-Times, others on topics from constitutional government to gay rights to design. He is a graduate of Emory University and lives in Atlanta, where he plays the double bass in the Emory University Symphony Orchestra. To introduce our panel this morning, which will discuss reaching underserved audiences with the message of liberty, please welcome Richard Lawrence.
Thank you, Larry. So you saw briefly in the video that queued up before Larry came on stage, a student who attended a program called Communicating Liberty. And we did that program this past August to teach young libertarian thinkers how to better talk with their peers about these ideas. And we're going to be talking on our panel today about communicating liberty, and especially with audiences that we really haven't spoken to all that much in the past, minority audiences and others that would be open to the ideas of liberty, but for the problem that we've never really tried to talk about. So we're going to be talking about those audiences and what we can possibly do to better message these ideas to them. I'm going to give a brief introduction to each of the panelists who are sitting on stage with me. Their full bios are in the programs at your tables. I'm going to start all the way at the end with TK Coleman. TK is the Director of Education at Praxis, which, if you haven't heard, is a fantastic new effort to give students apprenticeships and allow them to realize entrepreneurial goals. Check out Praxis at discoverpraxis.com. To TK's left is Alfredo Ortiz, who is the President and CEO of the Job Creators Network. This is such a cool organization that is working with CEOs around the country to get them to message the ideas of free enterprise and free markets to their employees. It's a very cool group. I would recommend you check out their website at jobcreatorsnetwork.org. And immediately to my right is my former boss, John Tillman, who is the CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute. John has become somewhat of a celebrity in the state-based policy movement for really, in a short time, making a deep blue state in play for free enterprise and free market ideas. So each of my panelists on the stage here today have extensive experience and background in messaging these ideas to people, again, who we as a movement really haven't put all that much effort into. So I'd like to kind of start us off, and we'll have time for Q&A after we have a little back and forth on the stage. I'd like to start us off with the question that I think a lot of us ask, which is, everyone always says we've won the battle of ideas. And if that's the case, why aren't we winning with students? What's up with students, John?
We're not in a battle of ideas. It's the great fatal conceit of our movement. And I'm sorry to say that. We're in a battle of emotion. And emotion is what drives the acceptance of our ideas. And so what has happened in our movement, and actually goes to the question I asked Larry earlier, what I believe our problem is we've become so fixated on selling the ideas, and in particular on selling the materialism of the ideas, the idea of material prosperity, that we've lost sight of the emotional connection of selling prosperity to the human spirit. I am not a constitutional scholar, or I know my founding history really well, but I do know it says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they switched out happiness instead of property. And when they are talking about happiness, they're not talking about let's go and have a cocktail tonight and get happy. They're talking about prosperity of the human spirit. So when liberty prevails, prosperity definitely follows, and certainly of the material economy, which is good and well. But we are fighting for emotional connection to human prosperity. We have to sell our ideas through that lens.
That's right. I think, when it comes to talking about markets, we don't only want to talk about material efficiency, we want to talk about how it allows people to become more civil toward each other.
Exactly. Another good example of this, a story I tell all the time, is about when we talk about energy, we tend to talk about the Keystone Pipeline, Anwar, offshore drilling, and of course everybody's new best friend, fracking. That is all good and well, but what we really should be talking about is the single mom at the gas pump. When the progressive agenda is ascendant, her gas is now costing, the pump used to stop at $30 or $35, but the numbers keep rolling like a Vegas slot machine. The pennies and dimes roll on, and goes to $60, $65, and then finally stops, and she pulls out her grocery list with her 2 kids in the back seat and starts crossing off items off her grocery list. She's removing food from her table because of the progressive agenda. When fracking prevails, the price comes back down and she can add a healthier diet, maybe hire the tutor for her kid who's struggling with math or English, and improve that woman's life. We have to sell our energy policy through the point where that policy intersects the life at the gas pump and the family budget.
TK, why do you suppose so many students are sort of gravitating toward statism, to solving these problems through the use of government force?
Yeah, I want to say when I first saw the title of this talk, I thought it said reaching undeserved audiences. This is interesting because one of my brothers is a youth pastor for an inner city church in Fort Wayne, and he also is a youth advocate for an inner city high school. And most of his job revolves around helping young inner city teens make decisions that are designed to keep them off the streets, stay out of jail, not just become another statistic. And one of the interesting things is that all of these kids come from conservative Christian homes, Bible-based ethics, and they will concede without argument most of what we call conservative ethics. But when they go out into the real world, they're confronted with these dilemmas that often result in them making compromising decisions in the name of what they call necessary evils. So one example of this is he had a recent discussion with a 15-year-old boy who says, I know violence isn't the answer, and I know that if I get caught illegally possessing a gun, it's going to hurt my family and it's going to hurt my future. But that's the only thing that keeps me safe. And when I walk to school every day, I know that there's a certain group of people every day that are going to take my money, they're going to kick my butt. He stated that a bit more explicitly. But this gun is what keeps me safe. And I think that illustrates something that is very much in line with what's already been said, and that is that there are 2 aspects to our relationship to truth. One, there's the philosophical aspect of how can we substantiate these claims to knowledge with evidence, with argumentation. But then there's a pragmatic aspect, which deals with how can I integrate these ideas into the circumstances and conditions that characterize my life? And how can I use these ideas to effectively navigate the complexities and creative challenges that arise? When people lack answers to the philosophical questions, they dismiss ideas as irrational. When they lack answers to the pragmatic questions, they dismiss them as useless. And if you beat them in an argument, you might make them feel guilty for not living in accordance with the truth. But when it comes time to make a decision, they'll simply say, I gotta do what I gotta do. And so one of the things that has to be done is we have to not only present our ideas as if they are true, but we have to give people a sense of imagination that allows them to see how these ideas can work at the individual level. And I think statism provides people with very easy answers in that regard. And they do an excellent job at giving people clear, explicit instructions, even if those instructions aren't good, even if they have negative externalities and so forth, for how they can get involved, how they can show compassion, how they can help the people they want, how they can take charge of their lives. And that's ultimately what people need. People need a sense of understanding for how they can take charge of their lives. And however imperfectly, statism seems to do that well. And I think one of the ways we can counter that is by presenting economics not merely as a study in human action, but as a study in power, that through an understanding of things like rational choice theory, incentive structure, scarcity, opportunity cost, you can actually become more effective at creating the results that matter most to you. And I think the better of a job we can present economics in that way, the more effective we can be at helping people develop this sort of confidence that these are not just good ideas in theory, but they're very powerful ideas in the realm of the concrete.
Yeah, the economic way of thinking is personal, fundamentally.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Alfredo, when you're working with business leaders, a lot of them employ younger people, unskilled people, people just coming into this country. What have you found works well when talking with them about markets and enterprise?
Yeah, and let me get to it, because I did want to circle back to your first question and comment on this. Is first of all, jobcreatorsnetwork.com. For those of you, informationstation.org is actually an employee-facing website. You mentioned something about materialism, and we're focused on the material. I think that the movement, so to speak, is so focused on the actual materials, not materialism, but even materials of delivery. There's something called, you got to win the heart before you win the money. And this is like psychology. When I actually come from a consumer product goods background, selling craft cheese of all things, right? So for me, it was about selling more cheese, right? What we're trying to do is we're trying to sell more ideas, the ideas that actually work. But we're so busy on selling the practicality, the economics of the ideas, that we forget that these are about stories of human nature, right? And if you think about history, just overall, humankind, it's about stories, right? It's storytelling. And we have forgotten about the storytelling aspects of this, I think. And that's why we've been failing. If you think about why the other side of the argument is winning in this battle, is because they're very good at storytelling. You mentioned actually fracking. We're very good about explaining the economics of fracking, for example, and the benefits of fracking, but we don't always talk about the story of the benefits of fracking. So, for example, we created a video that actually talks about not the actual economics that compares, the GDP output relative to et cetera, but we talk about Mr. Sandbag out in Philadelphia, right, where it's actually allowed. He was almost bankrupt before fracking came into Pennsylvania. And then after that, he created a little business called Mr. Sandbag. And that was literally to provide sandbags to the fracking industry. And through that story, we outlined basically how he was able to turn around his life, how he was able to basically get out of almost borderline bankruptcy, send his kids to college. His kids now are doing well. They're buying a home. And so one thing I would probably say just first, we can't forget that this is about human nature and human storytelling. And the better we can do that and create relevancy to people's lives, right? But that's the one thing we try to do at Job Creators Network, is relevancy of tying how government policies impact their how the government policies impact the pocketbook of their livelihoods. And that's what we're trying to do, is really tie that back with our storytelling more than anything. And even in our videos that we create, they're actually, unfortunately, fairly simplistic. But we've kind of found a common denominator area to be able to do that. So back to the question in terms of the relevancy, we've actually created 3 different coalitions that focus on young professionals, women, and Hispanic, actually. Because those are 3 areas that we believe are actually underserved from the perspective. And really need a specific and relevant message to deliver to them, to remind them about the American dream, to remind them that, it's about the long run, all people, right? I mean, I love that. It really is about the long run. It's tying that back to them and making them believe that American exceptionalism is alive and well, that the American dream is alive and well. Because I believe the other side of the argument has been doing a very, very good job of saying it's actually wrong. And the only way for you to progress now and to succeed in this country is to depend on the government. So,
Related specifically to the underserved audiences, where do you believe the greatest opportunity and challenge lies in messaging these ideas? They're probably one and the same. You want to address the challenge to take the opportunity.
I think we have to understand why we have such racial division, gender division, age division in the country. And this gets a little esoteric, but the short version of it is because of a concept called the blue wall. I don't know how many of you are aware of the blue wall. It's the electoral wall in presidential elections. The blue states start out with about 242 electoral votes, needing 270 to win. And if you're wondering why there's been, why did the left make so much of the Hobby Lobby case as an attack on women? Why did, as the famously now known Senator Uterus from Colorado run on these women's issues to the extreme? I hope you all remember that. Otherwise the joke rings dead and you laugh. Why is immigration not solved? Why does the president and progressives seem to gin up conflict after Ferguson and Eric Garner? It's because of the blue wall. And the blue wall is this. The Republican nominee in 2016 will have to run the table on remaining states that are not part of that 242 to win. But for the blue wall to be held, the Democrat nominee has to run the demographic table. They have to run up about 95% of the African American vote and then 70 plus of millennials, single women, and Hispanics. So they have a political incentive to create division and paint the right, using that term liberally, as anti all of those. And so our greatest challenge is that there's a tremendous electoral incentive for the left to continue to divide. And our opportunity, however, is we don't have to win all of those demographic groups to start out with. We have to sell in the language each one of them consumes, using channels they consume, and begin to peel them off, and then we can win with emotion and ideas, and then the politics will follow. But it's very difficult.
I mean, I'll just kind of comment again, almost going back to the idea of storytelling, right? I mean, it's the left does a very good job, right? And they say the left does a good job of, I think, creating a vision that says, we can take care of it, right? We can take care of you, right? Overall, and then with the other side of the argument, we again go back to the very we go to the brain instead of the heart. We go, let's tell you about the 9 or 12 or 15 or 18 different reasons, and we'll outline it very specifically. But we always forget about the one thing. Whenever I actually answer a question like this, I talk about like a Diet Coke can. And if you look at Coca-Cola, again, this is where I come from, right? So consumer product goods, so I apologize. But when you think about, for example, Diet Coke, anybody has a Diet Coke can, if you look at the ingredient statement, you would never drink that Diet Coke again. Phenol, whatever, this and that. And, I mean, it's a horrible ingredient statement, right? Why would anybody ever drink another Coke can of Diet Coke? But we do, right? Because they sell open happiness, right? It's Diet Coke, but it's open happiness. It's a light way of opening happiness, right? Instead of the ingredient statement. We for some reason believe that if we sell the ingredient statement, they're going to buy that Diet Coke. And again, I think what we need to try to remember is it's about the story. We got to remind, I think, these different targets that it is about the American dream story. Specifically when I talk about Hispanics, quite frankly, should be almost 100% conservative when you think about what their values are, where they come from in terms of family, in terms of entrepreneurialism and hard work. Those are all the values that we spew. But for some reason, they gravitate towards the left. Because we forget to tell them that we have a story, right? That we're actually selling about Diet Coke. We're about opening happiness, not about phenol whatever's, right, on the ingredient statement.
Well, I'll just add one thing I think that relates to all of this, which is about why we have a challenge. It's interesting. If you haven't watched President Obama's second inaugural, I recommend you do. It is a statement of purpose. And the fundamental battle we're in, and Larry talked about this in his opening comments, is the founding of this country is based on the idea of individual liberty. And by nature, we are unequal. So you will have inequality materially. And so if you are on the underside of the beam and inequality, you feel tremendous insecurity. You feel uneasy about your future. What the progressives are doing is saying is that problem is because of individual liberty and capitalism, because it creates this inequality and the gap is getting wider. And so only the government can come in as a fair arbiter and properly reallocate opportunity and resources to smooth out that inequality. It's a fundamental attack on the very idea of individual liberty. And this is why it's such a dangerous time right now. We have to fight back with stories based on emotional connections that connect with people's lives individually at the point policies intersect their lives to make the argument the founders did very effectively, which is the way to reduce fear and insecurity in your life is not by turning yourself over to the dependent class on the government who's going to allocate opportunity and resources, but by rather through freedom is actually how you become more secure and more optimistic about your future and more of an aspirational life. And we're not doing that very well as a broad movement, although I think the very fact that he is doing believe this session and this whole event is an example of us learning that we have to do better on it.
And if I could just add one more thing, if you don't mind, just a quick comment. Words really do matter. I'll tell you that I took over for Job Creators Network just about 14 months ago. And we were very focused on promoting capitalism, for example, which we all agree in. Right? But again, when you think about the word capitalism, this is where I say words really matter. Right? This is an indicator, it's a trigger that the left is actually using that capitalism is bad. If you think about whether it's in Hollywood, in movies, on TV, right? I mean, it's even in like the Jetstones, right? I mean, where it was like, bad Acme, the CEO, right? I mean, the CEO is always portrayed as a bad person, capitalism. So we actually brought in Frank Luntz to do focus groups for us to review all of our materials and all of our collateral. And it was interesting because capitalism was really viewed negatively as a word. So even that, we've been very careful now that we speak about economic freedom versus capitalism, because it really doesn't have a label, right? When you believe in economic freedom, whether it's left, center, or right? I mean, those are the fundamentals that we believe in. And again, the point there that I love that is free people are not equal, equal people are not free, right? I mean, it is about economic freedom, and it's the ability to do that. And what are the best ways to get to that economic freedom? So that goes back, I think, to the storytelling that, again, the left is doing a very, very good job of doing. We're not.
To build on these points made about language and storytelling, there's a very interesting book I recently finished by Mark Johnson and George Lakoff called Metaphors We Live By. And in this book, they talk about how the language that we use to describe experience actually shapes and structures experience itself, because it alters the way we perceive and process, the data of experience. So one example of this is the metaphor of argument as war. If you listen to the language that we typically use when we describe arguments, it's through the metaphor of war. So we say things like, he stood his ground. She conceded all of my points. She knocked down my arguments. I refuted his beliefs. And we don't just use this kind of language to talk about arguments, but we actually experience arguments in this way. When we have debates and arguments, we actually feel a certain sort of tension as if we're going up against an opponent. And Johnson and Lakoff suggest, what happens to an argument if we use the metaphor of a dance? What happens to the actual experience of it? What happens to the way it feels? What happens to our ability to effectively communicate with one another? And to bring that back to this, one of the dominant metaphors that many underserved, not undeserving demographics subscribe to is that of an us versus them sort of metaphor. That of a metaphor that says, someone is trying to hold us back. Someone doesn't want us to be free. In fact, if you look at a lot of the movies that really fire us up, they're based on this notion that, you take Harry Potter, for instance, that you're special, you're more powerful than you know, you're capable of more than you know. But someone over here doesn't want you to know how powerful you are. And they've invested all of this energy into creating a system that is specifically designed to keep you ignorant of the knowledge of your true self. You'll see it in Chronicles of Narnia, you'll see it in The Matrix. Find me any movie that's not about falling in love, and that's your fundamental problem. Now, I've had an interesting experience playing around with this. So when I talk to young black men about things like minimum wage, for instance, and I make the traditional arguments against minimum wage, I always get respect, right? I always get respect. I always get that sort of acknowledgement people give you when they can't refute what you say, but when they walk out of the room, their lives won't be changed. But then when I switch the script and I talk about the racially charged history of minimum wage laws and why those laws initially came into existence, independently of the reasons people might support them today, their eyes open up and they say, really? And I say, yeah, man, seriously.
Tell us that story. What is that story?
Well, I won't go too deep into it now, but essentially, minimum wage laws originally were designed to keep black men out of competition because there was no other way to stop them from undercutting their competitors by offering their labor, at an ever-decreasing price. And so minimum wage laws were designed to stop that, And, if you look at a lot of the regulations that limit economic freedom, it's not because of some sort of mass conspiracy. It's usually because of one person who's threatened by another person, and they want some sort of way to keep that person from experiencing their power because of a fear about what it's going to do to them. And whenever I can show how a lot of these regulations are traced back to that kind of story, people's eyes light up all the time, and they go, get out of here, you gotta be kidding me. And there's something about these conspiracies that really resonate with people. And it's easy to sort of dismiss that as, well, people love conspiracies because they're irrational. But what makes conspiracy theories irrational in most cases is not the suspicion that something is fishy. It's not the suspicion that we're not being told the whole story. It's usually the frivolous efforts we make to fill in the gaps with the first idea that comes to mind. But if you can legitimize that concern, that suspicion that something is fishy, and you can actually show them through history how there is a connection between that suspicion and a lot of the anti-freedom regulations and laws, I think people begin to see this in a different sort of way. So that's one of the things I've been sort of experimenting with and trying to persuade people of different ways of thinking. And I've been experiencing some success, so I plan on experimenting a little more.
I'd like to really quickly punctuate what everyone's talked about in terms of storytelling, because I'm no neuroscientist, but I've read around, and this is confirmed through studies, that the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that actually processes rational information, the data. But then you can actually circumvent that by presenting imagery through stories. And that imagery will stick around with someone. It doesn't go through that same critical lens that, say, for example, a statistic would go through something like, well, that doesn't sound right. I'm going to ignore that. It's not going to change my worldview. Go straight to the back of the brain through images, through stories, and you're going to have a lot more success. I want to move to questions from the audience in just a moment, but I do want to, really quickly, John, ask you quickly, when Occupy Wall Street began, you wrote an article, I think it was in the Tribune, the Chicago Tribune, trying to talk to those folks to bring them into maybe a little bit more of a free market mindset.
I wrote the article after coming home, coming back to the office the night before after the Heartland Institute's annual dinner, where our table consumed more than its share of wine. And the Occupy Wall Streeters were right in front of our office during this whole period of time, and they're out there. And so I stopped with a colleague and engaged them in a conversation, and it was fascinating, just so fascinating, because there was a lot of common ground, particularly on the issue of cronyism. We agreed on cronyism. We agreed on the outrageous immorality of the heroin addiction of student loans and running up massive debt, and how this particular guy I was talking to felt betrayed. So I was particularly engaging with this one guy, and all of his friends were around, and it was just a great debate. So I wrote this piece the next day talking about the common ground that the, what I'll call the conservatarian side had with the occupiers against cronyism, the insider deals, and that we want a level playing field, and that government steps in and actually does things that are harmful to what the very people that occupiers support. So I write this column, oh my God. The libertarian right, or whatever term you want to use, came after me like I could not believe. I had sold out. I was giving quarter to the occupiers. Who the heck did I think I was? I have never been so socially media abused in my life by the conservatarian side. I had to explain to donors what the heck I was doing. It was amazing when you try to write something, to reach out and find common ground with your opponents. It was a little disturbing, I have to say.
We're going to take a couple questions. We've got some roving mics. Justin's over on this side, Elisa's on that side. If you've got any questions, we've got a couple more minutes.
I agree with, or I like your comment about trying to win hearts over minds. And my view is in the next election, one of the big campaign issues is going to be the disappearance of the middle class. So I wonder what some of our thoughts might be, and how some of our appeals might be to that issue.
There's two reasons the middle class is disappearing. The first one is that so many of them have become affluent. That's a hard argument to make, nobody cares. So we shouldn't use that one in this room. It's true though. There's a record number of affluent people, so people in the middle class are rising. But the real question is, what about people below the mean, and particularly in the lower quintiles? And the problem is that everybody on the left talks about the gap between the wealth of the affluent and those less so. And what the what the one group wants to do is they want to keep pushing these people down so the two lines cross. And I think it's terrible just when someone gets to the top of the ladder to shove them back down the ladder. I think that's unfair and immoral. Somebody who starts out at the bottom and makes their way to the top of the ladder, what they want to do is push them back down the ladder. What I want to do is help the people that are at the bottom of the ladder rise faster. And so that the gap closes by having people at the bottom rise faster than the people at the top are rising, and get it as close as we possibly can. It'll never be the same because we're not equal. But our goal is to unleash those people at the bottom from the burden of government that makes it difficult for them to rise, and that's what we should focus on.
I had the opportunity to speak to Governor Bush the other day, Rise Up, something that, for example, he's talking about. And I think the idea there is right, though. It's the idea that we can raise all levels, all classes, right? And I hate using the word middle class, right? It's a middle bracket, right? Because it's not about class necessarily even. But I think I also had an opportunity to listen to Panetta, actually, a year ago at a convention. And he mentioned, I love what he said, and it was right after something that our president mentioned about the 1%ers. And he goes, I'm not sure if he goes, why our leadership in Washington, he's very careful about saying that, but why our leadership in Washington is so focused on the 1%. He goes, rather than focus on 1%, I'd rather see how we can make that 1% pie a 10% pie, right? And so let's just make more people, right? Let's allow more opportunity. Let the government basically get out of the way and help entrepreneurialism and the spirit of entrepreneurialism that's made this country great succeed and move forward. And again, it goes back to, I think, the storytelling aspects. One of the things that we do at Job Creators Network is we ask our CEOs, frankly, like Bernie Marcus, who was the founder of this, he was a small business owner, right? At 49 years old, he got fired as a CEO, right? And at about 3 years later, he created Home Depot, one store, right? And talking about that story, right now they label him, as this old, rich, white Jewish man, right? Who's a billionaire, or, has his yachts and whatever. I mean, that guy works probably harder than I do. It's unbelievable. 86 years old. And he works to be able to get his story out there. He talks about he was a Russian immigrant, went around with black gangs out in New Jersey, and how he was able to work his way out. I mean, even if, and I think there needs to be more of those stories, and we tie that to the ability of our economic principles that make this country great. Less regulation, less taxation, really, frankly, let get out of the way, right? Government get out of the way and let entrepreneurialism. I have to tell you, this is my political hat on, it's not as the president of the organization. At the State of the Union address, I was floored that the president took credit for the falling gasoline prices. I mean, I was like, weren't you opposed to the whole fracking thing, like every single breath you could take? The whole reason why we were successful right now is because of entrepreneurial exceptionalism in this country, right? I mean, entrepreneurs, despite the government, despite everything that was thrown at them, they still succeeded, they still figured out how to do it, and right now we're getting closer and closer to energy independence despite of the government. And so, I think we need to just be able to have those stories continually be told in a way that's relevant, to the American voter.
Richard, can I tell a story?
I think we've got time for maybe a quick story and then one more question. Let's do one quick story.
Okay, one quick story. So, when I was a little kid, my grandpa, we call him Papa Snoop, was babysitting us, and we received a phone call. I picked up the phone. I didn't know at the time that it was a prank call from one of my cousins. And he says in this mean-sounding voice, "I'm gonna get you," and I hang up the phone. I'm scared. That never left my imagination. So that night, I slept with my light on. Papa Snoop comes in the room and he says, "I can't let you sleep with your light on. We gotta turn that off." And I says, "No, somebody's gonna come get me." And he says, "You gotta turn that light off. No one's gonna come get you." I said, "Yeah, they are. Like they told me. They said they're gonna come get me." And he says, "Okay." He says, "I'll make you a promise." I said, "What?" He says, "If a thief breaks into this house, they're going to come get you first because your light's on. They won't have any difficulty finding you." And that got me to shut my light off. But the moral of that story is the things that we think we need to do in order to protect ourselves from the people we mistakenly believe to be our enemies are the very things that make it impossible for us to ever be secure.
Absolutely.
Good morning. Dane Starbuck with Liberty Fund. One of the challenges that I see with the movement is not recognizing or acknowledging the challenges that face first of all, those who may not go to college, those who had an opportunity to have a middle class lifestyle because of they could get a good job with a company in manufacturing, and those jobs are no longer there. The challenge that face college students who go to college, incur this huge amount of debt, which John spoke about, and then go out and find that they can't get a job to even pay off student loans over time, and how that prolongs adolescence because they don't make adult decisions. They've had to defer certain choices because of the debt situation. And then the third reason is the fact that you had mentioned that capitalism is portrayed as bad. And so oftentimes I think that's because capitalism is portrayed as benefiting only the very few, the 1% or so forth. So we talk about storytelling. How do we acknowledge these are truly structural problems that maybe we're not addressing? That, you know, when the baseline was there in the 60s and 70s, when manufacturing was at its height, when student loans weren't an issue, it seems to me we're not looking at the true structural challenges that are causing the tremors in the class debate, class warfare. How do we address that more effectively?
I'm pausing only because I jump in first all the time. Go for it. I think this is one of the hardest issues we face. It's a great question because it goes to something that I think is fascinating about our movement is we tend to want to dismiss the reality of the trauma that people are living in their life. And one of the phrases I like to use is that, you know, free enterprise and the founding principles are the greatest force for good ever created in human sphere, because I believe that. But especially for the poor and disadvantaged. But how do you bring it into life? Because our solutions are so abstract to those very people you're talking about, whereas their solutions are, we've got this work program over here that the government's going to fund. We've got free community college. We've got new trade schools for you that we're going to put you into. All of these things that expand the scope of government, very tangible, very specific. And even though they don't exercise those options, they feel that side is providing them with some sort of lifeline where we're saying, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I think this is very, very difficult. And I don't have an easy answer for this. I don't know how we do that yet. And I would entertain thoughts from the audience after this session. I think this is one of the hardest questions, and I have not come up with an answer yet. I'm hoping these two have an answer.
I mean, talking a little bit about just from the education piece of it, I have to tell you, I was saddened to know that we now have a K through 14 system. You know, adding the 2 more years of community college. I mean, to me, that was basically an acknowledgement that we have failed in our K through 12 system. We've had 2 more years of high school, basically remedial high school, right? And that's just a sad statement. I sit there, and I think I may have mentioned to you, for I think it's the past 5 years, the Wall Street Journal CEO Council, they meet once a year, all the top CEOs of our country meet. And what's the number one thing they always talk about as the issue in this country that is preventing us from gaining American exceptionalism again is education. What has happened to it? What has happened with that? Nothing, right? The debates are, again, between the unions and non-unions and the left and the right, and there's this fragmented approach to try how to fix it. But where has an actual, true national debate, for example, just on education, taken place that's involved the left, the center, and the right, right? I mean, it doesn't exist. And it's mind-boggling that with the luminaries that we have in this country alone, right, the level of entrepreneurialism that exists in this country, that we can, let's say, take 100 of these luminaries in 100 days, create 100 ideas to fix this thing once and for all, right? Because that is at the core, and I think the center of a lot of the things. We hear about racism, for example. Well, I honestly think part of racism is the belief that there's the haves and the have-nots, right? Well, the best way to help the have-nots is really to help educate them, help create a strong education system, and help them understand that the best way, right, to achieve success is to work hard for it. I mean, I'll have to tell you from my background, my own personal experience, I was poor as a church mice growing up. My mom and me used to go around in her white Buick LeSabre on trash day collecting newspapers and aluminum cans, taking them over the Y. That was our grocery money for the week, right? But we didn't believe in government handouts. We just believed that hard work ultimately was going to be the way to go. And that message seems to have we've forgotten about that. But I have to tell you that education, also for me personally, was the way out of that. And it wasn't necessarily through college. I did have the benefit of being the first through high school and college and grad school. But that's not the only way of doing this through college education. great trade schools, for example. We have a gentleman who is one of our CEOs, very successful, started from $5, and now is a $600 million company, doing exhaust bins in restaurants. And he created his 2 own high schools now as a feeder to his own company because he can't find people with education. He has 30-something open positions, and he can't find people with a high school degree that are actually qualified to run the machinery that he has. So he's now created his own schools. So, for me, it's again about tying that. First of all, it's time to do something about things. I always kind of say if I had to create a party, I would create the Enough is Enough party, because I think everybody, right, is to blame on this one. And we just got to fix things, right? Let's take this exceptional entrepreneurialism that exists in this country, and let's start solving problems instead of just talking about it.
I do want to add one thing I forgot to mention, is you always have to destroy loyalty to the status quo paradigm before people will embrace a new paradigm. So part of the solution to the question you asked is we have to continue to promote and educate on the destructive nature of the status quo progressive paradigm that is hurting. Though their solutions don't work, that's why this problem exists. And so we have to attack that vigorously in all the ways we've talked about with stories, individualizing the human condition, and going through the heart rather than the mind. And as we do that, we will then learn how to affirmatively make an argument for our alternative to people become more open to it. But I think that is the harder part of it. It's pretty easy to attack the failure of their side.
If I can add to that, I would say what makes us most vulnerable to the never-ending litany of political promises of goodies that are thrown our way every year is not the rhetoric of politicians, but the lack of confidence that we have in our own creative power. A savior will always appear to be useless to people when those people when those people are not conscious of themselves as victims. So it's our own consciousness of self as victim, as weak, as powerless, as unable to be the predominant creative forces in our own lives that makes us listen very closely when someone says, I can save you. And so I believe that if you can convince people or give people a vision of what they're really capable of, I think these promises become more and more irrelevant. We don't need any sort of special committees in order to convince kids to try to become the next LeBron James. And I say that because it's physically impossible for most kids to be the next LeBron James. And yet, more people who are capable of doing this will fight for their right to be the next LeBron. They'll go after it, even though politicians aren't telling them that they shouldn't do this, even though their parents give them really good logical arguments for why they shouldn't. They fight for their right to be that because nothing speaks to a human being more than their desire to come alive, than their desire to experience themselves as beings of creativity, beings of power, who get to do what they love, who get to be in charge of their narrative. And people like LeBron James represent that. Howard Thurman said, ask not yourself what the world needs, but rather what makes you come alive. Because that is what the world needs, people who have come alive. And I say that people have always been and will always be more loyal to their inner sense of what makes them come alive than to anything that's going on in the world. And what we need to do is we need to speak to that part of people and show them how these ideas can help them come alive. And when we help them do that, they'll create the options, like what he's doing with job creation, like what we're doing with Praxis, that will make people say, the options are there. And I don't really need to listen to what you have to say because we can do this better than you do, and we can do it on our own.
That was fantastic. Imagine for a moment that when Romney was asked the 47% question, if he had said that these 47% don't want to have that dependency ceiling put on top of them, they want to be set free and went off on that risk, he'd be president. Because that's appealing to the 47%, which is what your question's about. Awesome.
Well, I want to thank our awesome panel and great panelists, T.K. Coleman, Alfredo Ortiz, and Judd Coleman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I think a lot of people just have misconceptions about how free markets work. A lot of people just simply aren't aware of how much benefit we get from private markets and free enterprise. I think it's important for us to really maintain these ideas because it's not just for the wealthy or the affluent. It's also for the small entrepreneur. It's for the undergrads and college students, people just sort of getting out on their own. So I think it's important for FEE to reach out to young people in particular because they need to know why it is that flea markets help them, how it gives them the opportunity to make their own dreams come true, how it gives them a chance to contribute to their communities and help them be stronger.
Thank you, Richard, and John, Alfredo, and TK. What a great panel and a great video. Well, before I introduce our next moderator of a panel, I have a couple housekeeping announcements to make. One is, if you are trying to connect with Wi-Fi, I know that cell service is not the best in this room, but Wi-Fi you can connect with by looking for the network name Hyatt Meeting, and guess what the password is? Freeman. How about that? We don't miss a beat. Hyatt Meeting, and the password is Freeman. We've talked at the conference a couple times already about how FEE is seeking to create a network of influencers. And we're taking young people who are newcomers to ideas of liberty and inspiring them and turning them into activists ultimately on behalf of these ideas and in the process influencing other people for ideas of liberty. But our students are not the only influencers that we aim to help and encourage. Now, all of you can be, and probably already are, influencers of others. And one of the best ways to influence is to put some good literature in the hands of another person. And so I want to encourage you, while you're here or when you get home, to go to fee.org/bulk, B-U-L-K, because there you'll see details about ordering FEE materials in bulk at a reasonable cost for distribution to friends, service clubs, any groups that you may have contact with. That's fee.org/bulk.